Hello and welcome everybody. Good evening, wherever you are. My name is Kultuma and I will be welcoming you all this evening along with Di. And we would like you to tell us where in the world you're from. And because we are doing a talk on social media, we'd like to know what social media you use or have used. And if you don't use social media, what social media do you know of in the chat?
We've just got people arriving now. Welcome everybody. Just make yourself, comfortable. We can't see you, you can see us. So let's see where you're all from and your social media use.
Hi Saeed, Saeed's here from Pakistan. See loads of people from Manchester tonight. Lots from Manchester tonight.
Got Gibraltar there as well.
Good evening from Gibraltar, third year student in Gibraltar.
Yeah. Loads of people now on the apprenticeship turning up. So those that have just joined, just put into the chat what sort of social media that you're using or that you have used or that you've heard of. So we've got Saudi Arabia there. We are travelling afield.
Yeah. Zimbabwe, I've just seen as well.
We are at 3 minutes in now, Siobhan. Do you want to start or?
Do you think so? I think we've got, is it around? Oh, yeah.
300 almost now, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I can see lots of people from, I think we've gone international quite early on again tonight. Yeah. So, people are saying hi, Diana, because they've missed you the last couple of weeks. Diana's back tonight. So it's great to have Diana back with us tonight. So,
yeah, can I just say thank you to Siobhan, to Diana, and also to Omar as well, who studied at the University of Birmingham. I just want to say thank you to the Social Work Connect team as well for making me feel so welcome, and the opportunity to actually present to you today. I mean, I have to admit, I am just getting used to doing these types of sessions, because I do tend to prefer face-to-face, because you do get an opportunity to see if your audience are falling asleep or if they're actually listening to you or not. But I hope to keep you all awake for the next hour or so anyway. And the advantage, obviously, of doing this is that we don't have to try to find a room for 600 odd people on a cold Wednesday night in Birmingham. Now, I hope that the presentation goes well, but if there are any hiccups along the way, I hope that you do forgive me, but I'm sure it'll all go well. Can I just say that I want to thank you for taking the time to attend, and I hope that you find the session interesting. I am conscious that I probably won't be able to address all of the issues that may have encouraged you to attend the session, but I do hope that what we do explore does enable you to go out and look for answers to any wider points that you want to explore based on the content of this session. I hope you find the session enjoyable, and even if it doesn't answer all of your questions, I hope that you'll leave feeling a little bit more aware of some of the broader issues that can impact on children and ethical debates about using social media sites in safeguarding children. And to begin with, what I want to say is that this presentation is based on our research. And I think that it's always critically important that when you conduct research, that it goes out of journals and universities and out into practice. So I hope that by doing this presentation, that we're delivering some messages that make a difference to practice and help to improve the lives of the people that we work with. Now, I have put in my notes, I hope you have a pen and paper ready, although, you can use your phone, you can use a computer to take notes. Towards the end of the presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce 3 case studies to you. And I've tried to develop them in a way so that basically they pose questions to you that were triggered from our research. And what I want you to do is I want you to take notes and actually respond to the team about how you would respond to the scenarios that I'm going to present to you. In terms of the presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the question, to look or not look. And what we're doing is we're exploring the ethical challenges of Facebook use in child protection with children and families. And the focus of the presentation is for me to introduce you to some findings about Facebook use that resulted from a 2-year ESRC funded research project that basically looked at, well, what enables effective relationship-based practice in child protection in social work. But what I want to do as part of the presentation is look at broader human behaviours. What makes us do the things that we do? Sometimes we think about these things, sometimes they just happen automatically. And it's about that element of reflection. You know, we always talk about reflection at university and in practice, but we do have to look at those elements of reflection that make us think about, well, why did I do that? Why did I think that? So to explore that and to set the context, what I want to do first is I want to illustrate how digital connectivity is basically becoming part and parcel of the fabric of our everyday lives. Then what I want to do is I want to explore what our research found about Facebook use in social work with children and families. Then we'll go on to the case studies that I talked about to consider some of the ethical dilemmas posed in using Facebook in social work. I mean, I focus on Facebook, but obviously when I use the term Facebook, I am talking about broader social media as well. When we end the presentation, or indeed as we're going along in the presentation, I want you to consider, can you have a simple response to a question of looking or not looking at Facebook posts? Or actually, is the question much more complex than that? Is the answer and the response much more complex than that? There are some considerations that I want you to take into account. The presentation is focused on social work, but the principles discussed actually apply to all professions. So if there are members of the audience from teaching, from health, for any other discipline, basically, the principles will apply in the same manner. I use the term service user to basically represent somebody who uses the social work services. Now, if, for example, your service recipient is a student, patient, client, or some other term, definitely do use that term, interchange service user for that term. And in presenting the research, and I think that this is a very, very important point, our aim is not to criticize social workers' social media behaviors, but to try to understand them. And this is the purpose of sharing research. It's about learning from each other and to develop practice that is better as time goes on. And social media use in social work is actually an emerging field, something that we need to stop, think and debate about. And this is a complex area. And I make no bones about this, that you may leave with more questions than answers. I don't apologize about that. I hope it really stimulates thought and discussion that leaves you going out looking for more answers. And so the aim is to encourage you to leave asking questions and to enable you to find specific context within which you can answer those questions. So the session structure is that I'm going to do a presentation and then I'm going to introduce you to the case studies. And the aim of the case studies is to encourage you to start thinking, also for us to have a bit of a debate. I've put the little graphic of that individual there because basically with the pandemic, I couldn't go out and record case studies. So I've used a bit of software and an animation. So when you see this person talking to you, please don't be surprised, okay? I've tried to do the best that I can. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Facebook lessons from research. And the presentation is basically based on our paper. And this paper is freely available via the Journal of Technology and Human Services. And I'll leave the link with Siobhan's team so that people can get direct access to the paper. And the paper's title is The Use of Facebook in Social Work Practice for Children and Families, Exploring Complexity in an Emerging Practice. And the authors are myself, Liz Beddoe, Professor Harry Ferguson and Eileen Joy. And so what I'm going to do is at the second stage, I'm going to introduce you to the research to show you how our research was conducted. And then I'm going to lead you on to a discussion based around some case studies that actually demonstrate some of the things that came out in our research in practice. But before we do that, I do think it's important for us to consider, well, why are we talking about social media? And what is it about social media that we need to understand in relation to setting the context for the reason why we conducted our research in the first place. And this is important because we've got to look at some of the reasons why people actually put material online. If people didn't put material online, then basically as social workers, I don't think that this would be an issue that we would need to discuss. And so I want to provide a little bit of context. So let's have a look at this, a new norm. About 8 years ago, 10 to 8 years ago, social media use really rocketed. And the BBC, for example, talked about how we're living a Facebook life. We're using apps like Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, YouTube to basically broadcast information about our lives. And if we look at the Office for National Statistics based on data around Great Britain for households and individuals, looking at 2020, here are some of the main points. In January to February 2020, 96% of households in Great Britain had internet access, and that's up from 93% in 2019. And in 2006, when the ONS first started keeping these figures, internet access was at 57%. And so that has grown at a massive rate. And when you think that it's 96% now, that's easily going to move up into the 99 area within a few years. And I'll come back to why that's important shortly. Internet connections in households with one adult aged 65 or over have increased by 7 percentage points since 2019. But these households still had the lowest proportion of internet connections. So how old you are has some bearing on the internet connectivity that you have. And in January to February 2020, 76% of adults in Great Britain used internet banking, increasing from 30% in 2007. So more of the stuff we're doing is online. And this one I found really fascinating. Of those adults who have a smartphone for private use, 17% did not have security on their smartphone, and a further 32% didn't know whether they had security. And if you think of all the private data that we hold on our phones, I found that actually quite astonishing. And the final one basically talks about how the internet is starting to integrate into other aspects of our lives as well. And so the point of showing you this is that internet access has increased. The age range that you base in terms of access also has a factor to play as well. And that the internet-based activities that we engage in have grown and grown and grown, and they will continue to grow. You know, we do things now without actually stopping to think about it. Post up a video, post up a photo, check our bank statements and so on. And all of this actually has a profound impact upon our behaviors. And if we look specifically at Facebook use, and this is looking at data from 2018 to 2020, and I've drawn this from data that was published on the 5th of January 2021. So this is relatively up-to-date data. As of December 2020, there were 51 million Facebook users in the United Kingdom. That's over 6 million more than the number of Facebook users a year prior in December 2019. So we've got easy access to the internet, more of us having access to the internet than not, and a lot of us are actually using social media like Facebook. So it is a new norm. In fact, it's unusual if you're not using these facilities. So why is this important? It's about the changing nature of communication. Now, it might surprise you to know that I actually remember what life was like before the internet and social media. I know I probably don't look that old, but I am, yeah. And so in the pre-social media era, staying in touch basically involved, we used to have these things called telephones that were tethered by a wire to your house. So if somebody was going to phone you, you'd have to make a time to be at home to pick the phone up. Surprising, isn't it? Yeah, because you couldn't take your phone with you. So time played a factor. Distance played a factor. When members of my family moved abroad, it was very rare that I'd be able to catch up with them because phone calls were expensive, and it would be months on end before we found out about what was going on with them. They may post some photos to us in an envelope. And so distance mattered as well. And also there was privacy. If I wrote a letter and I sent that letter, put some pictures in, it only went to the recipient unless they decided to photocopy it and stick it on their neighborhood. But even then, only a few people would have access to that information. And confidentiality, anything that went on within the home generally stayed in the home. So even if you were undertaking social work visits, unless you stood at the window and looked through the window, whatever went on in the home was only what the people in the home wanted to tell you. So time, distance, privacy, and confidentiality all had an impact. All of that has changed because with social media, the major impact, the primary focus of social media is to create networks that enable you to share information. And that has an impact, that has a profound impact. And so now, in the way that I described before, time and distance don't matter. If you post something up now, instantly within your network, it is available straight away, whether you're in New Zealand, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in Birmingham, whether you're in Wolverhampton, whether you're in Canada, wherever. Time and distance are now no longer a factor. And what I always find fascinating is that mobile phones and smartphones are by far the most popular devices to go to access the internet. And when you look at these graphics, you see that the younger age group are actually represented in the higher categories in terms of mobile phone use. So if you want to, at any time, you can whip out your phone, take a picture, create a video and post it online, and immediately it's shared. And how many times do you actually stop and think, should I share that? Should that be shared or shouldn't it? And so all of those factors play a part. Once you post onto Facebook, for example, people have access to that information. The information is shareable. There's not really much confidentiality because anybody can screenshot something and send it to somebody else. And there's also a digital record as well. So even if you try to delete things, there are caches and so on, and people can still access that information. So now, from a situation in which you had a degree of privacy, the moment you start accessing the easily available internet and the free social media tools that you have at your disposal, all of your information is out there. That level of privacy just disappears, and that has an impact. And the impact is that the capacity to broadcast details of your family and children's lives has never been greater. It's simple, you can just do it. And there is information that has been shared. For example, Debbie Greaves, for example, has helped produce the Respectful Sharenting document. Debbie was on here not too long ago, a few weeks ago, and she's produced a booklet based on her work around what are the rights and implications of sharenting for children and parents. And this is a systematic review where she demonstrates some really good do's and don'ts. And the thing that really struck me was this statement: the average parent posts over 200 photos of their children every year, but the majority don't check privacy settings regularly. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I do really find that fascinating. So I go back to my question. The capacity to broadcast details of your family and children's lives has never been greater, but should you as a professional look? As a social worker, for example, if you know the information is out there, should you look? Well, what we've got to do is we've got to look at personal and professional boundaries. And when you're a social worker, as a professional, I'm going to teach you a new word now. Okay, write this one down. You've got to be a funambulist. Okay, I thought if nothing else, you learn a new word today. So what's a funambulist? A funambulist is a tightrope walker. It's good, isn't it? Yeah, it's a tightrope walker. And when you're a professional, when you're looking at personal and professional boundaries, you are walking a very tightrope type situation where is the blurring of the lines? Where are the clear lines between what should be personal and what should be professional? And in England, if we look at the professional standards, one of the clear professional standards, well, all of them are clear, but I've pulled out three that I think are relevant to the presentation today. One of the things that Social Work England asks us to do is to establish and maintain the trust and confidence of people as social workers. And another one is that as social workers, we will maintain professional relationships with people and ensure that they understand the role of a social worker in their lives. So this helps to kind of create those boundaries within which we must act. And when it talks about technology, it says that we will not use technology, social media, or other forms of electronic communication unlawfully, unethically, or in a way that brings the profession into disrepute. But what does unlawfully, unethically, and disrepute actually mean in the context of social media? Because these things need to be explored, and they're not as simple as they first seem. The British Association of Social Workers social media policy actually encourages social workers and social work students to use social media, but to do so responsibly, because we can't shut ourselves off. This is, as I've shown to you before, the internet is there, social media is there, and the ability to share is there. We've got to be part and parcel of that environment, but we've got to do that in a way that's ethical and in a way that's responsible. Now, over the last few years, there has been a discussion about, well, what are the knowledge and skills and behaviours and boundaries that social workers need to learn about? And writers such as Amanda Taylor, who's actually a good friend of mine, actually talk about bridging the knowledge gap between social work and what she refers to as digitalisation. And when you go back to, say, for example, 2012, there was already discussion about digital communications and how they're beginning to play an increasing role in the lives of social workers. But there was already an awareness that along with the opportunities to share best practice and reach service users, professionals need to be aware of the pitfalls. And those pitfalls have actually increased, because if we go back to 2012, the use of the internet and social media was nowhere near as high as it is now. And even back in 2013, questions were being asked: can social workers tell if a child is actually at risk online? And what are the skills that they need to do to develop caring in that situation? But there are pluses as well: community care online, Twitter, and indeed, you know, the social work Connect team here, we're all using different facilities to connect with each other, to develop practice. So there are pluses as well. And for example, we've used Facebook at the University of Birmingham to connect Canadian students, Australian students, and our students to talk about developing professional networks for social workers internationally. And also the use of Twitter has been very powerful as well. When there was a documentary about baby Peter Connolly, academics such as Harry Ferguson and other practitioners were actually able to engage with journalists such as Alison Pearson and so on to try to put across the perspective from social workers. So there's a powerful voice that can come out for the profession when we work together. But there are also issues, there are pitfalls, for example, with behaviours and boundaries. Social workers have been struck off, as in this example, where a childcare worker was deregistered because they befriended a mother of a service user on Facebook. And so it's about having clarity. What are the things that you should do and you shouldn't do? Here, a social worker in Essex actually posted on her Facebook page that having 3 children removed from their homes was a career high for her. And when it came to the disciplinary panel, she said, oh, I didn't realize that my settings were public. But it wasn't the fact that they were public, it's whether she should have put this post up at all. And it's these elements that actually need to be explored in much more detail. So to summarize so far, just to set the context, basically, a major lesson to take away is that there is a huge blurring of lines between what is private and public life. The capacity to broadcast what goes on in our households has never been greater. Trottier, for example, actually starts to raise concerns about this and says social media make large sections of social life visible, and investigative agencies are taking advantage of that visibility. Surveillance studies need to focus on how this visibility is being used by these agencies, because we've got to think, well, when is it right and when is it wrong to actually do this? And this is why we pose the question, but should we look? Should we look? Is it morally and ethically right to ignore possible sources of Facebook data that could help you protect children from harm? Should we look? So let's have a look. Let's explore that in a little bit more detail. I hope that set the context, because we need to understand the environment in which we work so that we know why these questions are important. And what I want to do is I want to go into a little bit of depth about some of the messages from our research. And to do that, I want to give you a little bit of background data to the research that we conducted, because you need to know where the information came from and whether you should actually trust it. And you know, to do that, you need to understand what we did and why we did it and how we did it. So the research background was that basically our title was Organisations, Staff Support and the Dynamics and Quality of Social Work Practice, a qualitative longitudinal study of child protection work. And we were funded by the ESRC between 2016 to 2018. And the methodology that we used was based around the following research questions. One of our research questions was, how do social workers begin, develop and sustain relationships with children and families over time or not? So how does this work, or how doesn't it? The second question was, what is the influence of organisational cultures, office designs and forms of staff support and supervision on social workers and their relationships with service users? So we looked at not only what social workers do face to face with each other, but also what goes on around them in terms of their organisation and their culture that either aids or hinders their ability to develop sustaining relationships with children and families. And we used an ethnographic research approach. And so what we did was we had teams at 2 social work offices that were 200 miles apart in England. And as I've mentioned, it's 15 months of field work that we undertook. And what we did was we followed social workers around. We followed them in their offices, in supervision, we followed them in their cars, we followed them into service users' homes with appropriate permissions. We observed what was going on. We followed them into hospitals, into courtrooms. And so literally we were the shadow of the social worker. And what we were doing was we were observing and analysing a range of intimate behaviours. What was the atmosphere like? What was the eye contact like? Was there space to sit in the house? Were we welcomed in? What did we do? What did the social worker do from the car to the front door, from the front door to the living room? What was the emotional elements that were going on? What was the impact, and how did that have an effect on their relationships with the service users and the children? And it's the first study ever of long-term social work practice based on observations of practice and organisational work and culture. So it was really in-depth and long-term. And in terms of the research design, just very quickly, there was 15 months of field work at 2 sites, and we looked at different office designs. One was a big open plan, hot desking office with about 60 staff, and another was a small office, was an office that had small teams of about 5 to 12 staff, and they had their own desks. And so can you see the difference in the organisational culture there, open plan and small? And then the observations in the offices included supervision as well. And we also interviewed social workers with their managers as well. And we observed practice with service users, and service user interviews were taken at 3 points in the year with appropriate permissions. And what we did was we aimed to study 12 months of practice in about 15 cases at each site. So you can imagine there was a huge amount of data generated. We spent 402 days in the field, conducted 146 home visits and 271 practice encounters. And if you want to have access to our research articles, they are available free of charge at this website. It's https://swcpp.weebly.com. Okay, I'll just leave that there for a couple of seconds so that you've got access to that. And all the articles that we've published so far are freely available for you to look at. Okay, serendipity, a happy chance, basically. The use of social media was not an intended focus of our study. But what happened was, as we were observing social workers, it started to emerge during the field work. We started to see it happening. And so while there's been existing research that's used surveys, interviews and focus groups with social workers to kind of demonstrate that social media platforms are being used as part of child protection work, the fact that we conducted a long-term ethnographic approach meant that we were able to actually see and witness what was going on, and we were able to record what was going on and then actually talk to social workers afterwards and their managers, and just simply observe over a long period the different elements that were influencing the use of things such as Facebook. And so that's the background to the research. And at this stage, I have to be honest, I've kind of gone through that a little faster than I thought I would have done. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring you to the research itself. And the three elements that really jumped out from our research when we conducted the analysis of the data that we gathered, what we found was that Facebook use took multiple forms. Some social workers actively searched for service users' Facebook pages. They actually actively went there and looked for them. Some others opposed any such uses and felt that it wasn't appropriate. But then what we found, and something that wasn't in the research that we explored prior to this, was that there was a third group that were unwillingly drawn into acting on Facebook information. So they had no choice because they were given the Facebook information by other members of the families they were working with, or indeed their managers. And in that situation, can you see how whether to look or not look suddenly becomes a little bit more complex? Let's explore that a little bit more. And these are some discussion case studies. What I want to do is I want us to have an exploration of this. And I want to set the context. Is it morally and ethically right to ignore possible sources of Facebook data that could help you protect children from risk of harm? And what I want to do is I want to explore the influence of behavior via the lens of three different approaches. There's monitoring, surveillance, and being drawn in. And I want you to make a note of these three different lenses: monitoring, surveillance, and being drawn in. Now, I want to try something, and I hope you do this with us. I don't know how it's going to work because I've never done it on this platform before, but let's give it a go and see what happens. What I want you to do, I'm going to introduce three case studies to you. And what I want you to do is I want you to take notes whilst listening to what's actually being said to you. And what we'll do is we'll try to do a little bit of a discussion as we go along. And as a team, we did try to figure out how we were going to work this out. So then what I'll do is after we get feedback, I'll actually go into looking at the points you should have considered when you responded. And those are based on our research. So let's try this one out first. We're going to look at monitoring. And I'm going to set the context for you. So I want you to imagine that you've had a new colleague start with you, and they come to you and they ask you for some advice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this video twice. They're not very long. They're less than 1.5 minutes long. So get something to write down your thoughts with, and I'll introduce the video to you. So I want you to imagine you've a new colleague start with you, and they come to you and they ask for some advice. How would you advise them? Okay, are you ready?
Hi, I wonder if I can have some advice. In my old workplace, we used to use Facebook to monitor the families that we worked with. You know, to see what the parents were up to and to make sure that the children were safe. My old manager always used to insist we should use all the information available to us from any source that's going to make sure we can carry out comprehensive assessments of families, and said that when we go out on our initial visits, we should always let the families know that we may monitor their online profiles. Because I'm new here, can you tell me, should I continue with this practice or stop it? And what arguments could I use to justify the approach that I take?
So what you're being asked to do is this is a colleague. So they say to you, because I'm new here, can you tell me, should I continue with this practice or stop it? And what arguments could you use to justify the approach that they take? How would you advise him? And I want you to monitor something right now. What's your gut reaction? Yes, he should, or no, he shouldn't. Make a note of your gut reaction. What's the thing that's come straight out? Yes or no? And what are the reasons for that? And what we're going to do is I'm going to play it again. Then after the second time I play it, take a couple of minutes to gather your thoughts and record your thoughts. And then I'm going to take it back to the team. And before we move on to the next case study, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about what people have said and what they thought. Okay, so let's run this again. Monitoring. Imagine you had a new colleague start with you and they come to you to ask for some advice. How would you advise them?
Hi, I wonder if I can have some advice. In my old workplace, we used to use Facebook to monitor the families that we worked with, you know, to see what the parents were up to and to make sure that the children were safe. My old manager always used to insist we should use all the information available to us from any source that's going to make sure we can carry out comprehensive assessments of families, and said that when we go out on our initial visits, we should always let the families know that we may monitor their online profiles. Because I'm new here, can you tell me, should I continue with this practice or stop it? And what arguments could I use to justify the approach that I take?
And so again, because I'm new here, can you tell me, should I continue with this practice or stop it? What arguments could I use to justify the approach I take? How would you advise them? So it's 7:40 now. If I say about a minute and a bit, just to record your thoughts. Siobhan, can I pass over to you and then we can move on to the next one?
Absolutely. I think Kulchuma was okay to tell us her thoughts on this one, but actually I can't see your camera on, Kulchuma. Do you want to just pop your camera on and tell us? Thank you. Tell us what your thoughts were just listening in. And we've only just listened to this at the same time as everybody else, haven't we? So, but what are your thoughts now, having listened to that?
Having listened to that, I agree with some of the comments that have been mentioned in the chat, and I do agree that everybody's got a right to a private and family life. So I would probably advise to not go snooping on purpose. However, if somebody's brought evidence to your attention and they can provide you just that bit of evidence, then that is something that you could consider.
Sorry, Kulchuma, I'm going to stop you there because you're kind of moving into the other ones. Let's just stick with what's being asked here. Let's not kind of move into that other area. Let's stick with what we're being asked here. So should he continue with this practice or should he stop it?
I think it needs to stop because they would be violating their right to a family and private life.
But what about the safety of the child?
You would take all of that into consideration, and there's
but then what's your answer?
I'd still be, my gut says no, because you would have to go. I know you've got to consider all the information available to you, but that is, I don't know, I think that for me that's looking too far into everything. If there's significant harm, there should be enough evidence without having to go onto social media.
Okay, so does anybody in the chat disagree?
I think Kelly can tell us about, I think we were going to go to Kelly to summarize a little bit of the chat perhaps, but I was thinking, I don't know if I'm allowed to comment at all, but I don't know, my thoughts were slightly different. I think I'm very conflicted. I'm thinking, you know, when Kulchuma was saying there, no, I think it should stop, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if that's a bit too clear cut. I don't know, I wonder whether, because I've been a social worker for so long, I'm much less clear cut about lots of things. So I don't know as I've actually got an answer, because on the one hand, I think this is violating somebody's right to privacy. On the other hand, I think, but they've put that out there into social media. And I think what's maybe at the back of my mind is, but what if something happened to a child? And then what if it was in the newspapers that it's all over Facebook and the social worker never looked? That would be a concern to me. So I'm just not really sure. I think I feel more conflicted with it, I think, than Kultuma.
But what I'm interested in is that neither of you have actually mentioned the fact that what he says is that when I go out on my first visit, that I'll actually tell the family that we may look at their social media profiles.
That's a real, yeah, absolutely. Maybe what we're doing is trying to jump straight in before we're really listening to what he's asking us.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it's sort of, it's such a big, we're just think no, or yes, or we're jumping in too quickly, perhaps.
And this is what I mean about emotions. Yeah. It's interesting that bang, somebody, you know, you come up with a decision, but actually if you listen carefully to what he says, is that in my previous job, I did, you know, we did tell service users that one of the sources of information we may use are their social media sites. And yet, you know, it's like as if that bit was completely missed out altogether. And this is what I mean about gut reactions and behaviors, is that this is quite a, it's a powerful subject. It causes people to have strong views. And when you have strong views, you're more likely to jump to a position without actually stepping back a little bit and thinking, well, hold on, have I heard everything? But does that make a difference? Does it make a difference if somebody tells somebody that they, you know, if a social worker tells a family that they're going to be viewing their social media pages? Let's move on to the next one. That was fascinating. Thank you.
I think, yeah, and we've got different members of the team wanting to jump in on different ones. And I think also as well, just what's going on in the chat is really interesting. There's so many different things happening in the chat. And it may be that people say, oh, actually, you know, can we have the chat sent out to us as a resource afterwards? Because there are so many perspectives in the chat. I think you're really prompting people to think, you know, so yes, it's exciting to hear the next one now.
Let's move on to the next one. So this one was monitoring. Okay, so make a note, monitoring. So this one is surveillance. So I want you to imagine that you are a new manager and one of your social workers tells you the following in supervision. How would you respond? And again, I'll do it twice because I think sometimes the words need to be heard a couple of times. Okay, so imagine you're a new manager and one of your social workers tells you the following in supervision. How would you respond?
I found Facebook really helpful in my work. I mean, it's really useful to see if members of families I'm working with are still in contact with each other when they aren't supposed to be. As a rule, I don't tell them that I look at their Facebook posts. For example, there was a mother that I worked with where she told me she'd broken up with the dad of their little girl. So he's supposed to be her ex-partner now and wasn't supposed to have any contact with their little girl at all. But I checked Facebook and saw a recent picture of him at the mum's house. He was sat with a joint in his hand and the girl on his knee. When I asked Mum about this incident, I didn't tell her I'd seen the picture on Facebook. Some of the team thought that it was a bit intrusive that I'd used Facebook, but I think it's okay to get this information. I mean, the mum has no privacy settings and her pages are on public display, so anyone can see what's happening. You see, I've got a massive caseload and it's really an easy way of keeping an eye on families. I know some team members have concerns. I want your permission to carry on with this way of working because don't you think it's morally and ethically right to use whatever sources we have to see if children are at risk so that we can intervene to keep them safe?
So I know some team members have concerns. I want your permission to carry on with this way of working because don't you think it's morally and ethically right to use whatever sources we have to see if children are at risk so that we can intervene to keep them safe? Well, how would you respond to this question? And again, monitor your gut reaction. What's your gut reaction right now? Yes, you should carry on, or no, you shouldn't. and make a note of that, but then take a step back and think, well, okay, that's my gut reaction. But if I think about it a little bit more, would I change my opinion? Would I change my response? And it's okay if you don't, but the fact that you've taken a moment just to stop and think about it is sometimes all you need to do. So again, I'm going to play it again for you. Imagine you're a new manager, sorry, and one of your social workers tells you the following in supervision. How would you respond?
I found Facebook really helpful in my work. I mean, it's really useful to see if members of families I'm working with are still in contact with each other when they aren't supposed to be. As a rule, I don't tell them that I look at their Facebook posts. For example, there was a mother that I worked with where she told me she'd broken up with the dad of their little girl. So he's supposed to be her ex-partner now and wasn't supposed to have any contact with their little girl at all. But I checked Facebook and saw a recent picture of him at the mum's house. He was sat with a joint in his hand and the girl on his knee. When I asked Mum about this incident, I didn't tell her I'd seen the picture on Facebook. Some of the team thought that it was a bit intrusive that I'd used Facebook, but I think it's okay to get this information. I mean, the mum has no privacy settings and her pages are on public display, so anyone can see what's happening. You see, I've got a massive caseload and it's really an easy way of keeping an eye on families. I know some team members have concerns. I want your permission to carry on with this way of working because don't you think it's morally and ethically right to use whatever sources we have to see if children are at risk so that we can intervene to keep them safe?
Okay, guys, so how would you respond to that?
So I think David was going to take this one, I think. What were your thoughts, David? You've been promoted to team manager. I saw people saying in the chat that's been promoted.
All right, second year straight to team manager. I think there's a few things to consider here. Like, obviously, we don't have any clear-cut answers. Taking a step back, you say, sorry
to interrupt. I am sorry to interrupt. But what was your gut reaction? Would you allow them to carry on or not? And then please explain.
It's hard because I've been reading the chat too, but my gut reaction is no, I wouldn't allow them. I think for first reason is that as social workers, we're supposed to try and maintain connections and physically see service users as we can, as and when we can, and make sure they're physically okay. Just because you see a picture of them on social media doesn't mean they're actually safe. And if you start to think along the lines of, oh, I've checked on them on social media, I've seen they're alive, they must be okay, that kind of thing. So that aside, the other reason I would say no is the whole argument that's going on in the chat is a massive invasion of privacy. So even if you've not got privacy settings on as a parent, do you have the education to know what privacy settings are? Do you have the education to know what can be done if a social worker looks into your life? Do you have the education to know that a social worker can see your life? And like as far as you're aware, if you don't have the education, that social worker only knows what's happening when you tell them what's happening. So in a way, this is a bit of a bold statement, but it could be a form of entrapment. So that's my gut reaction on it. I wouldn't allow it. I would tell them gently that they need to keep an eye on their caseload because obviously, like, I've not in practice, but I know we're all overloaded. But they need to work better to make sure that happens. But
what about the fact that they've seen somebody in the home who's not meant to be there? And then then do you reveal your source of information if it's actually a source of information that protects the child? I'm playing devil's advocate, by the way, as you can probably
No, it's a good thing to consider. Like, as soon as the video said about the man with the kid on the knee and stuff, I was like, if they shouldn't be there, they shouldn't be there. If that's like a legal agreement, then you need to I think you need to seek guidance further up, even higher up maybe, or you as the manager need to go higher up again and try and figure out where that goes, because there's the moral obligation to keep that child safe. And if there's a legal agreement to keep that other person away from the child in order to keep the child safe, then you need to find a way to act on it. But with regards to revealing how you've been surveilling, how you've been playing Big Brother, that could really fall back on the entire social work world, really, and it could cause risk to the child inadvertently. So,
Okay.
sorry, that's not a clear answer.
No,
Testing,
but it's interesting because you've justified one, your kind of moral perspective, and then what you've tried to do is you've tried to balance your moral perspective with a practical kind of understanding of the situation. But then when you throw in the fact that actually this act, even though morally you might not agree with it, results in the well-being, the potential well-being of a child, and safeguarding from harm, then that kind of plays into that argument as well. By the way, I am not advocating one position or the other. I'm just playing devil's advocate because my job is to generate thinking. So please don't anybody think that I'm telling you to do one thing or the other. We'll explore some of this in a little bit more detail when I move towards the conclusion stage. Okay. But okay,
thank you.
fascinating. Thank you for that, David. I'm going to move us on to the next one. Sorry, Siobhan, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say one thing that I thought was really fascinating, because I was trying to listen more to the wording this time because you picked me up. I'd not got the wording right last time. But I was listening, and he said, I want your permission to carry on with this. So he was almost coming to the manager, asking the manager's permission to do something. So why would you ask for that permission? And or it almost feels like he felt it was wrong, but he just wants someone else to say, yes, you carry on. So that was just something that I noticed. I don't know, that wording of give me your permission to do this felt a bit uncomfortable.
And so can you see the complexity emerging? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is through using narrative, things that people can potentially ask you. And this is what I think brings the research to life. And so the last one I'm going to go to is the drawn in one. And so again, imagine you're a manager and one of your social workers comes to tell you the following. How would you advise him to proceed? Okay, so you're the manager. How would you advise him to proceed?
You know that I'm not on Facebook and I don't know how to use it. Even if I could, I wouldn't go looking for online information about the families I'm working with because I think it's an invasion of their privacy. You know that I've always thought that it's important to develop good working relationships with families to encourage positive changes, and that to do that we have to be open, honest, and have respect for their privacy. But recently, the new case that I've taken on, well, I've had different family members sending me screenshots from Facebook showing me things like adults who aren't supposed to have contact with the children being in their house. I am concerned about what I've been sent, but I'm cautious because I don't think you can always guarantee that anything that's put on Facebook is factual. I need some advice. Can you tell me, should I act on the information I've been sent or ignore it? Should I ask somebody from the team to look to see if the Facebook posts are real? And if I have to act on this information, I want to tell the family that the information has come from their Facebook posts. What do you think would be the pros and cons of me doing this?
So here, I need some advice. Should I act on the information I've been sent or ignore it? Ask someone from the team to look if the Facebook posts are real? And if I have to act on this information, I want to tell the family that the information has come from their Facebook posts. What do you think would be the pros and cons of me doing this? How would you advise them to respond? So again, I hope it's helpful to do this twice because I think sometimes you miss it the first time. So imagine you're a manager, and this is the last one, by the way, and one of your social workers comes to you and tells you the following. How would you advise them to proceed?
You know that I'm not on Facebook and I don't know how to use it. Even if I could, I wouldn't go looking for online information about the families I'm working with because I think it's an invasion of their privacy. You know that I've always thought that it's important to develop good working relationships with families to encourage positive changes, and that to do that we have to be open, honest, and have respect for their privacy. But recently, the new case that I've taken on, well, I've had different family members sending me screenshots from Facebook showing me things like adults who aren't supposed to have contact with the children being in their house. I am concerned about what I've been sent, but I'm cautious because I don't think you can always guarantee that anything that's put on Facebook is factual. I need some advice. Can you tell me, should I act on the information I've been sent or ignore it? Should I ask somebody from the team to look to see if the Facebook posts are real? And if I have to act on this information, I want to tell the family that the information has come from their Facebook posts. What do you think would be the pros and cons of me doing this?
So again, if I pass it over, Siobhan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think Kelly's going to go with this one.
Yeah, I think my gut reaction is that I would discuss it with the family before I decided to do anything. I would, if they'd been emailed or printed off or whatever, I would do my best to remove all identifying information of who's sent it, and I would discuss it with the family and say, this is what I've been given, what's happening, and give them a chance to kind of tell me, oh, it's not real, or oh, well, it was just the once, or oh, well, I didn't know you'd be looking, and give them the chance to explain to me what the pictures are showing, because I think there might be something deeper going on. I think it says a lot maybe about the family dynamics, about why are people giving you this? What's their agenda? And are you going to jump straight on what they think is happening? Or are you the social worker and are you going to weigh the evidence up if it is evidence? So I think I would discuss it with the family because it's about trust.
So you would act on the information.
Yeah.
And then would you ask anybody in the team to check to see if the Facebook posts are real or not?
No,
No.
I don't think that's my place. I think I would act on it, but my way of acting on it would be to show the family and say, can you tell me about this? And, without saying, I think it's real or it's not, or I'm going to do this because you've done that. I think that would be my way of acting on it.
But then, and again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Would there potentially be a con side to that, in that a source of information suddenly disappears because the family are aware that, their life can be looked at via Facebook?
Yeah, I think that would be a con. And that person has every right to alter their privacy settings or not to post it. But you have still got what you've still got what somebody's shown you, or you've still got a print out of what they've given you. So you've only got what you've got. But it's like saying I've looked through somebody's windows and if they shut the curtains, I'll ask them to open them again. I can't really.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. Okay, guys, I'm going to move us on because I've got about another 5 minutes before we finish. And I think it's important that everybody's here stays for the next bit, because it's critically important that you get the feedback in the next bit. Can I just say thank you to everybody for taking part in the discussion? And trust me, we can go on for hours about each one of these, but obviously we haven't got hours. But I do, if you're tempted to leave, please don't leave for at least the next 5 or 6 minutes until I go through the points that you need to consider when responding. And so the first thing I asked you was about, do you remember we talked about behaviors, about what encourages behaviors? And one of the things that encourages our behaviors is our ethical standpoint. And so what our research demonstrated, that it's not as easy to answer this question as look or don't look. It's actually very complex, and it's influenced by many, many factors. And so if a situation like this arises, here are some of the areas that our research demonstrated that you should discuss in any of these type of situations. The first is your understanding of what your ethical standpoint is. Now, if you take a primarily Kantian ethical standpoint, you will say, don't look. Culture, this is you probably, yeah? is that actions should carry the principle of respect for persons. Therefore, any action that results in a social worker deceiving or acting covertly to access a family's social media information to undertake child protection work is just considered morally wrong. And it's important to know that that's your ethical standpoint, because unless you have the permission of the family in terms of monitoring, you would say no to that situation. But be aware that you still need to roll back a little bit and think about, well, is this the right one here? And Siobhan, if you don't mind me saying, I think that yours might be utilitarian in this situation, just in this situation. And again, it's just being aware of your automatic ethical response, and that the moral worth of the rightness or wrongness of an action lies in its consequences. The right action is that which produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If a good consequence is produced, such as protecting a child from harm, then the principle of justice is achieved. And so if you're taking a utilitarian stance, then you don't, I'm not saying you, Siobhan, by the way, but, you know, just ethically, people may say, well, actually, if the ends justify the means, if we end up protecting a child, then it's okay to look. And so can you see the two different stances? And it was interesting because each one of you, when we played the case studies to you, the video case studies, everybody in the audience would have had an immediate reaction. And those who were more Kantian would probably say no. Those who are more utilitarian would probably say yes. But it's important to know that that's your initial gut reaction. In terms of accessibility, we've seen that basically social media does make large sections of our social life visible. And as investigative agencies, we can potentially take advantage of that visibility. But then Boyd also argues that there's a performative aspect to posts as well that kind of tend to exaggerate or misrepresent the truth. And so you have to question the reliability of online findings as well. And Colmes and Torb, I mean, Kelly talked about looking through somebody's window. I mean, they argue, well, what's the difference between a practitioner sitting outside somebody's house and following them around physically compared to following them online? You know, ethically and legally and morally, is that right? The difference between following somebody around physically compared to online is that the internet gives you the ease, convenience, invisibility, and inexpensive nature of the activity. It's just much easier to do. It's much easier to look at people's past posts and to quickly check up on what somebody's doing. And so accessibility plays a part as well. And one thing that we found was about being drawn in. If you took a strong Kantian ethical position and you wanted to respect the service user's rights to privacy, and you wanted to develop good relations to do this, you want to be open and honest in your interactions, even when working under difficult circumstances. And what happened was that with the people who were drawn in, the social workers who were drawn in, they tended not to use social media, so they weren't proficient in its use. But even then, they were still unwillingly drawn in. And what they tended to do was tended to act on the information because there's a tendency to be risk averse. And Siobhan raised the issue earlier on that, well, what if it's in the newspapers that suddenly, you know, that this evidence was out there online and social workers didn't look. And so that is being risk averse. And so all of that plays an element into it as well. And then there's a lack of clarity around the law because nobody asked, is it legal to look? You know, is it actually legal for us to look at online posts? Well, under English legislation, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, REPA, appears to bar professionals from using social media in an investigatory capacity. Under this act, viewing social networking sites by members of the state, such as social workers, in an investigatory capacity once is not classed as surveillance and does not require REPA authorization. However, repeatedly viewing social networking sites of service users without their consent, for example, to check on their relationships, falls under the definition of surveillance and would appear to require prior consent of the person posting online or REPA authorization. And so what our research has demonstrated, and this is why I was at pains to say during our discussion around the case study that I'm not telling you to do one thing or the other. What I am telling you to do is that check with your legal agency, check with your agency for legal advice, because this is a contested area. Because if you read our research paper, you'll see that actually even barristers are kind of not clear about what constitutes surveillance. And also, in any child protection setting, check to see if there's a multi-agency joint protocol to make sure that actually you're not putting evidence at risk or the ability to present evidence at court. So these are two things I would definitely recommend you to do when it comes to this, is check for legal advice from your agency, and also check to see if multi-agency joint protocols exist for looking at any evidence that's presented to you. And anxiety is also a major influence in looking as well. So, I mean, David mentioned a couple of these things as well. Not this one, but you know, it is austerity. In the last 10, 12 years, there's been a lack of investment in social work. And this leads to higher caseloads that lead to higher levels of anxiety. And what we found in the research was that some service users did not want social work involvement and were uncooperative and secretive. And social workers' use of Facebook was an attempt to find out more about what was going on in their lives. And so this was part of a strategy to cope with anxiety and risk, and for workers and organisations to defend themselves against the unbearable feelings of uncertainty about the safety of a child. And that the culture of social work and child protection that produces these anxieties isn't going to change unless the emotional complexity of the work and the risks and dangers it deals with day in and day out is acknowledged, and adequate resources and meaningful emotional support and supervision is provided for staff. So, you know, structurally there needs to be a change, because anxiety can influence you to behave in particular ways. But above anything else, I want to point out that when we were undertaking the research, we didn't know about REPA as researchers. So we don't know whether some of the social workers actually had permission under the Act to view social workers' pages. And we weren't able to go back to find out, because we only became aware of REPA after the research finished. That's why I always say that it's incredibly important to check the legal standing. And so that's the end of the presentation. So this presentation was based on our paper. It's freely downloadable. But what I'd like you to do in terms of next steps, I hope you found the presentation helpful. I want you to make a list of the questions that this presentation has raised for you and your agency. What are those questions that you've been thinking about as the presentation's been going on? Make a plan with deadlines to have those questions answered, because it's critically important. And then read our research, please, and see if it can help with the above process in terms of addressing those questions and developing a plan. And if you want, let me know how you get on, because I'd be interested to know how, if at all, this presentation has got you thinking and got you acting on the research findings. And so this was To Look or Not Look, exploring the ethical challenges of Facebook use in child protection with children and families. And the areas that we recovered were exploration of human behaviours. I attempted to illustrate how digital connectivity is becoming part and parcel of the fabric of our everyday lives. I tried to explain to you what our research found about Facebook use in social work with children and families. We looked at and considered some of the ethical dilemmas posed in using Facebook in social work. And also, we got you to consider, well, is there a simple response to the question of looking or not looking at Facebook posts? Or is it more complex than that? And that's me. And so if you do want to get in touch, my Twitter handle is @Akali65. There's my email address. And thank you for taking the time to listen. And the upcoming sessions are Wednesday the 17th of Feb, Love in Social Work Practice, Wednesday the 24th February, Deaf-Blind Awareness, Wednesday the 3rd of March, the Three-Way Shuffle, a method of communication social work, and Wednesday the 10th of March, Celebrating Social Work. And again, thank you. I appreciate all those people who have taken the time to attend, and thank you, Siobhan and the team, for letting me present as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, I tell you what I've found fascinating, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading this later on, is when you started off, the chat, everybody's responses in the chat were yes or no, yes or no. And now you're getting almost an essay as a response. You know, you've really made people start to think and to really be able to I suppose, explain their thinking, which I think is brilliant. You know, it's really funny to watch going from yes or no to these like almost essays that have been coming out. So I know we wanted to go back. I think I just wanted to say to Diana, and I think Diana might have wanted to say something about the chat as well, but I wanted to just say to Diana to thank you so much for the recommendation for tonight's session. You told us all it'd be brilliant, and it was brilliant. So what did you want to share anything, Diana?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that when I first did this lecture with Tarsum, it was absolutely incredible. But I think watching it back a second time, there were so many things that I learned. And I think looking through the chat box and seeing people's different perspectives and where they were coming from, or, you know, the laws for England are completely different from the laws in Scotland. And you have people discussing, okay, wait, is this going to be illegal in Scotland or Ireland? And I think it's just interesting. And I think another point was how the interlink between other professions. What are other professions doing in terms of social media? And how does that impact our profession? I think that's interesting. People were talking about like mental health services, the police, health, etc. I just think it was very interesting. And yeah. People are saying that they're going to do more research. I'm going to do more research.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, start with our article, because I think that's a good place to start, because there's a good number of references in there that you may want to explore further.
That's great. Thanks so much.